Welcome back to the Skid Factory, where today we're kicking off a new build series. Aussies will recognise this vehicle, maybe even New Zealanders straight away. This is an Australian icon from the 80s. For everyone else in the world, this is a 1988 VL Holden Commodore. So this car is built on a European GMV platform. It is sort of closely related to an Opel Rekord or Senator. But we've got all our own sort of styling, etc. They built 151,000 of these between 1986 and 1988. Very popular model. It's an iconic car in the Australian sort of hot rodding scene, if you will. There's a few reasons for that, which we'll get into shortly. This car is owned by a mate of mine, Tom. He bought it about maybe 4 years ago. When he originally bought it and brought it up to show us, he said, this car's got 41,000 kilometres on it. And we said, no, it doesn't. It's just got a broken speedo. So he brought it in, we put it up on a hoist, and our eyeballs fell out of our heads. It still had the original tyres on it that were about to explode. It was 100% original, everything immaculate and perfect. And it was indeed a 41,000 K old car that had been owned by someone in their 90s who'd passed away. He just stumbled across it at a car yard from where it had been offloaded by the family. So a huge find. These cars, you know, they're old. Most of them have got 500,000 kilometres on them. So it was a big thing to find one with this low Ks on it. He's always wanted one. So he sat on it for this long, waiting for me to do what we're going to do to it. So let's have a look under the bonnet and see what all the fuss is about these cars. And it's not because it's a Holden. This model came with a few different engine choices. One of them was an old carburetted V8 that they had it was related to sort of a late 60s engine. But this is why this car was so special. You'll see it says Holden on the valve cover. Well, it's not really a Holden engine, it's actually a Nissan RB30 engine. And Nissan more or less produced this engine in this form specifically for the Australian market. It was fitted to this model car and also to the Australian delivered R31 Skyline, which was an Australian designed car. It wasn't really the same as what they had in Japan. So the reason why this engine is in this car is because prior to this, in the VK Commodore, which was the previous model, they still had an old 60s engine in them. And they put EFI on it and stuff, but it was still junk. And in 1986, Australia changed over to unleaded fuel. So we started to use catalytic converters and that sort of thing. 10 years after the States and Japan and probably Europe. We're a bit late, but the problem with the old engine is they couldn't get it to run on unleaded properly. It was just so antiquated. This engine is a sort of a clean design. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the RB series of engine. Obviously GDR is the sort of the main thing that people think of, but there's a ton of variants of RB engines. RB30 is the biggest one, I think. So the thing about this engine was that it was a revelation for Australians. We'd never seen anything that ran this smoothly before. Everything was pretty agricultural up to now. And this engine was just amazing at the time. It was just so smooth and quiet. The transmission was a 4-speed automatic, which we pretty much didn't have. That also worked really well. It's your Jatco unit. So it turned this Australian car that used to have agricultural engines into this really nice to drive vehicle. And it sort of reset the bar for what we expected from vehicles at the time. The other thing about them was shortly after they released this, they released a factory turbo engine, which again was a Holden only engine, even though it was built by Nissan. So it was, they put like a T34 Garrett, which was junk you know, by today's standards, but any turbo was a good turbo back then. And they upped the power to 150 kilowatts from 115, I think, which doesn't sound like much, but again, these cars aren't very heavy, and at the time, it was a phenomenal thing. But what it opened up was a base engine that was really easy to modify, and it really got Australians into turbocharged cars. The only other vehicles you could get with turbocharged at the time were more like 4-cylinder engines, and they weren't very good either up until the 90s when we started getting some decent stuff. But this engine in its turbo form was robust. It had no compression. It was 7.8 to 1, which is ridiculous by today's standards. The reason for that was we didn't have fuel quality that could handle anything more than that. It also didn't have an intercooler on it, just for simplicity's sake. So 7.81 to compression. A couple of years later, we started getting better quality fuel. All of a sudden, you can put 40 PSI out of a Scania truck turbo or something into the engine. They used to cut down intercoolers off trucks and fit them in the front, do whatever to make the fuel go in there. Again, this is in the early 90s probably. Big scene. Eventually built autos. We got around problems with anything, and they were just a huge car. I guess by American terms, you could maybe compare it to a Buick Grand National as far as the turbocharged 6-cylinder scene, drag racing, big in drag racing, and a heap of fun and quite reliable. So this engine here is obviously just the NA version. It's an executive, which was the sort of base model vehicle. This thing's got no Ks on it, so it's pretty fresh. All the wiring's good. They did have problems with wiring going bad, which just with age. This one's pretty fresh. So what Tom desires is to build a VL turbo, which is a real common thing to happen these days. Heaps of NA engines. Obviously the majority of them were NA rather than turbo. The turbocharged ones are expansive. Because it's such an iconic vehicle, you're paying $30,000 for a turbocharged version of this car, which is just crazy. They still sell. But for the average guy, you can go pick up a VL, obviously not one this nice, but you know, a couple of grand, you can pick up a VL with the old NA motor in it. You can pull it apart. They're simple to work on. You can buy everything for them. You can buy a turbo manifold. You can delete the distributor. You can buy an inlet manifold. You can buy an ECU. You can get the auto built or the manual. The manual's the same as an RB25 Skyline manual, a big box in the turbo versions. The diffs are common. You can get them rebuilt. You can do all this stuff. It's a formula. Then you can go out and run quarter-mile times. So they're a great base, and anyone can do it. It's a cheap build. This car's not cheap because it's a bit special. That's why it's here. But what we're going to do is what anyone can do with a VL. So let's pull the engine out. This car came with a factory immobiliser back in the 80s. Works awesome. Not really.
Doesn't run too good, eh, Al?
Yeah, I don't think it likes being cold, and it also has been sitting in my garage for months. And also they did tend to run like shit, because they had some hybrid EFI system, half Japanese, half Australian, and mainly run by some very fit hamsters jogging around inside the box. So that is one of the things that we're going to change, obviously. Upgrading the ECU, the injectors, all that sort of stuff from the 80s into the 18s is a good idea.
So Al, if we're just turboing this, why are we pulling the motor out?
Well, you can just unbolt the exhaust manifold and bolt a turbo setup on them and put an oil drain in and that sort of thing. However, in this case, we are replacing the transmission as well. The rear diff has already been replaced with a disc brake version with good gears and a limited slip centre already, so that doesn't need to be done. We've got a built auto. It's a Jatco 4 N71B, which is what was fitted to these from factory, which is basically a 4-speed version of the old 3N71B from the 70s. Not a particularly strong gearbox in factory form. However, these things have been used for drag racing for so long that they've just perfected the art of making them work, replacing things that break with better parts and that sort of thing. And we end up with a really good box that works, I don't know, let's just throw a figure out there and say they work it well into the 9s before people start replacing them with power glides and stuff like that. So we've got one of them to go in it. So by the time I take the gearbox off, pull the head off it, etc., I'm going to end up with a block dangling around in there, and I've still got to put an oil drain in it. So I'm just going to pull the gearbox out and then take the engine out and put the engine on a stand. The reason why we're taking the head off is because he wants to put a cam in it. Yes, you can do that without taking the head off, but you've got to put valve springs in it. These things were also prone to cracking heads because of this radiator that Holden designed and did not a very good job of it. So never a problem in R31 Skylines because they had the Nissan design radiator set up in them. They adapted to make these work, and something went wrong and they always used to crack heads. So we want to pull the head off and make sure that it doesn't have the start of a crack in it. They were doing that when they were 3 years old. So this, just because this has got low Ks on it doesn't mean it hasn't started the fault. So Tom wants to do this right, do it first time and just get it done. So pulling the engine out allows us to work with it. We put studs in it and a metal head gasket, which they also never had. And it's going to be sort of good to go for making some decent power reliably. Turbo-wise, we're going to use a factory turbo manifold on it, which is just a cast piece. It's a great design. You know how I feel about this sort of stuff. It works perfectly. We're going to put a GT3582 on it with a 106 housing. The turbo is actually straight off a XR6 Turbo Barra engine. So it's brand new, it's never been fitted of course, but that's what its spec is. It's a good size for this engine with a auto with a converter. So it's probably going to come on hard at about $4,000. Put a 3800 converter on it and you end up with a real nice car to drive. It's got great top end, but still behaves well. So anything else that needs to be sorted out will. I don't expect to have too many issues with it because it's just such a virgin of a vehicle. Like it hasn't had 1,000 people drilling holes in it and bashing it with hammers over the years. I think we're going to put the battery in the boot, but I'll have to check with Tom. I can't remember because it's been sitting in my garage so long I've forgotten. We've got to move a few things around. We've got a cast intake plenum that is an Australian product to go on it that virtually looks like that, but it removes the throttle out to the front and puts a larger throttle on it because this is tiny and having it go over the manifold makes it difficult to do intercooler pipes nicely. So the goal of the scope, I guess you would say, is we want to keep it nice because it's a nice old vehicle, make it look like a nice old vehicle under the bonnet still, but give it all the new bits that it needs to make it actually perform reliably and also start and run nicely. Obviously, it doesn't sound great That's just age. So we got all the bits we need, and we're going to get it done.